Guts?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And joining me tonight in our Make Me Wanna Holla, all things black people, the diaspora, and our all things Canada edition is two of my returning champions. We have Berneta L. Haynes, sci-fi fantasy author, outspoken leftist, helper of other struggling writers, and consumer protection attorney, coming to us from Atlanta, Georgia, United States of America. And then coming to us from Nova Scotia, Canada, is L. Jones. L. Jones, who is co-host of The Breach's YouTube program, contributor to articles there, poet, social and racial justice activist, anti-imperialist peace activist too, and an outspoken, passionate abolitionist. And she is a teacher and professor at Mount Saint Vincent University, where she teaches political and cultural studies. Both of these heroines and sheros of mine are my guests. So first off, ladies, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me back.
Yes, it's an honor to have you. It's an honor to have you both back. I feel like this is a remix edition of the special Canada 4th of July one. Except we need Margaret Kimberly on for that. But anywho, it's always difficult, like trying to monitor three fantastic guests. So anywho, we're gonna go with this. So, ladies, first question I wanted to ask you, and Berneta, we'll start with you, and then Elle, you can answer the questions that's posed, and then we'll rotate like that. Is on the issue of police abolitionism, which I'm still agnostic on the issue, but I completely know both of your point of views on the but I know both of you's knowledge on this subject, and I'm willing to be converted and not be just agnostic anymore on the topic. But one thing that's often said from abolitionists is that the police were set up to be the racist thugs and the state terrorists that they are. That there's no reforming the police. To so allow me to counter that argument and push back a little bit that argument and say, why do you feel that you can never ever reform the police? Because couldn't you easily say the same thing about the education system or even the social care system and the welfare system, in which lots of grotesque racist shit happened there, lots of grotesque classist stuff happened there. So why abolish the police, but when it comes to like education or welfare, we can reform that just like the way the right wingers reform it to make it more grotesque. But of course, we're social justice people. We want to reform it to make it actually like work for the people. Berneta, your response followed by Elle's response.
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical way to answer this question is to look at why these things exist. So why do police exist versus the education system? If you ask yourself that question, you come to two very different answers. All right, policing system exists literally because of inequalities that linger. Inequalities in wealth, inequalities along the lines of race and so forth, patriarchy, all of these things inform why we even have policing in the first place. That's not necessarily true for education, for the education system, for example. Okay. And so in my opinion, I believe that it's important to strongly consider police abolition, not just because really understanding the need to actually reform some of these other problems would undo the need for a police system, but also because at the end of the day, police do far more harm than good. That's not true for the education system. That's not true for our social welfare system necessarily. Police ultimately do more harm than good. There's no need to try to continually reform a system that doesn't really provide a great benefit ultimately to society that it serves. It just doesn't.
Miss Jones, I'm curious your response.
I hate to tell you this, Youri, but we do want to abolish the child welfare system because it is also policing. There's a great book by Dr. Adil Abdullahi that just came out, Black Women Under State. And the whole point is that Ontario Works, which is the social assistance program in Ontario, acts as a gateway to criminalization for Black women. So social workers often appoint themselves as police. They collaborate with CBSA, the border forces. They frequently call the police on people. Social workers do not need a warrant to enter your home, unlike the police. So once you're on their radar, they can come in anytime. They can look through your fridge. They can observe your parenting. They can get in your pockets. They can get into your womb, into your vagina, like who are you having sex with, is giving you money, all of that. So it's an extremely intimate form of policing that Robin Maynard also talks about in her book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada, right? So child welfare is actually intimately connected to policing, particularly for Black women. 42% of kids in the child welfare system in Ontario are Black kids. Over 80% of kids in the child welfare system in Winnipeg are Indigenous kids. And they're not in child welfare because of abuse. They're there because of so-called constructions of neglect and motherhood. So people like the Collective of Child Welfare Survivors in Toronto actually are like, we need to abolish social work. There's quite a lot of discourse on the whiteness of social work and what we call carceral care, which is within supported care systems such as health, education, social work, etc. There's a long history of white people phrasing as care oppression, particularly through women, like white women missionaries, white women teachers that went around the globe and taught little black Sambo, to kids in the Caribbean and stuff. So as said, like, okay, we don't want to abolish education as such, but obviously many people want to reconstitute education. Many people have talked about how education is only designed for 10% of people, and there's a lot of discussion about there's Black people homeschooling or community schools or Black run schools, like, which is really just removing education from the system. Child welfare, many people are saying, I guess, social works, particularly like white female social workers, have been intimately involved in colonization and oppression of Indigenous and Black kids. And like, why can't we do this in another way? Like, help families retransform themselves, help families heal. So it is actually part of the same continuum of punishment, of exclusion, of, who's seen as human, who's not, who's judged as like proper and who's not. So yeah, actually we do want to abolish those things too. But the police, we perhaps want to reconstitute them in other ways, like within community, but yeah.
And actually, yeah. Do you want to say anything else about that, Berneta?
No, I'm really glad she said that, because I wasn't going to speak much on the social welfare system, because I'll be honest, I'm just not super well versed in it, despite being married to a social worker. But I like what you said about it being all part of the same fabric. We see policing cropping up in so many different spaces, even in schools. In some ways, I've heard the statement say, that folks have that, sometimes Black kids' first interaction with police is with their teacher, for instance. And so policing does crop up in all these different ways. I just think that in terms of abolition, and in terms of the United States in particular and what we see, the need to abolish police in particular, before even necessarily getting to some of the problems in these other systems, is really, really crucial when folks' lives are on the line day after day after day, and police shooting after police shooting. And that's just the police shootings. That's not even the harassment that leads to the incarceration problems that we see. So I will stop there, because there's a lot more I can say about police abolition, but suffice to say, I appreciate it, you drawing the connection, to how policing shows up in all these other spaces.
But then, but that being said, and then a quick follow up then is like you said, we don't want to abolish education. We don't want to abolish like the system of education. Don't want to even abolish the the idea that somebody from the States actually comes to help out people who are in desperate need and who don't and are having a hard time navigating the system when they are. When they do live lives of chronic poverty and stuff like and stuff like that. But again, you could also say that because as you mentioned, Ms. Jones, and I have read Robin's fantastic book. Because as you said, like, those systems themselves are also you can make the argument. We do make the argument that they are also founded to be racist. If people want to broaden it up, classist and and whatnot, but do you think that like there's more room for for reforming that, restructuring that, and having even like because and even like a community control over that kind of stuff, just like a community control over the police as one way of getting to a place where we don't have this pandemic of police shootings and murders and corruptions and so forth and so forth. And
So
yeah,
this is your
we can respond.
this
Miss
is
Jones
your
first, then Berneta.
I mean, this is Foucault, right? That all these institutions arise at the same time: the school, the factory, the asylum, the prison, and the purpose is to mold our bodies into being citizens, workers, and military people, like to serve the state, right? As obedient, conforming bodies. And those who don't conform are either killed or arrested or criminalized by the police, sent into prisons, have child welfare sent to your door, fail out of school, and condemned to the so-called underclasses. Labeled as mad and placed into the asylum, right? So that, like, this is just straight Foucault, right? That all of these institutions, this is Michel Foucault, sorry, French theorist. So all of these institutions are actually connected through modernity, and that's his point, that the modern age is around this molding of our bodies into obedient bodies. Now, the police, because they have the right to use force, as is being pointed out here, are more urgent in that particular sense, in that if a teacher beats you up in the classroom, that teacher's getting fired. Like, but if a nurse beats you up, that nurse is getting fired. Like, nurses can't just go and a cop can do it and not only not get fired, not only keep their job and do it again and again and again, but be held up as actually doing good policing. So the kind of stakes are higher in that sense. And obviously the amount of violence and force that is used is higher, and the amount of authority that police have is different as well. But these issues, yes, children's minds are Black kids go to school and have their spirits crushed every day and get suspended and have their life shaped. So, there's a lot of discussion around removing children from those environments. And the school to prison pipeline is well explored, right? How schools mold kids for prison and act as prison. So there's a lot of work on connecting these, but yes, I mean, at least the teacher can't shove a gun in your face and put handcuffs on you. Now they can call the cop from school, like right. We'll have a cop working for them. And again, so many of these institutions gateway the police. So cops in schools, cops working in the emergency room, security within the forensics hospital, right? So they connect to policing, but also, yes, their call is to the police, and then the police come and do the violence and the arrest and carry the child out in handcuffs. So, they're connected in that way. But I think the point, why police? Because, police are right there killing us on camera. That's why police,
Yeah. I 100% agree with every single thing you just said, Elle. And I would add that it's about police abolition, and the focus on police abolition right now is, from what I can see, for two reasons. It's about, one, prioritizing, as you just basically illustrated, Elle. Like, there's a matter of urgency in terms of what we're seeing from police and why we need to be focusing on abolition. But then it's also, the second part of this is that policing is kind of the root of the problems that we see across these systems. And so in some ways, targeting the actual root cause of these problems could change the culture in such a way that some of those reforms we actually need in the education space, in the social welfare space, can actually be more achievable by actually changing people's minds about the very notion of policing, and whether we actually need policing. So I'll stop there because there's more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Then this leads to, and you know what? I'm going. One of these days we're going to have another episode, which is dedicated to the racism that comes with the welfare state, the racism that also comes with schooling and stuff like that. But I want to focus specifically then on the thugs. What do I call them? The thugs in blue. That's what I call them. The thugs in blue. But then I have to. Okay, let me push back against. Let me push back against this. What do you do when a deadly terrorist attack happens? Now, the interesting thing about that question, and the reason why I bring it up, and Elle, we talked about this last time when Margaret was on the program. When there was that deadly terrorist attack that happened in Manchester at the Ariana Grande concert by Wahhabi by Wahhabi extremists. I thought it was very interesting because I know that like the police, in Britain, which is actually where most of the modeling of policing has actually been copied, was from Scotland Yard, which they were not there actually even to solve crimes like murders. It was basically to keep the Irish, who were the most rebellious colonies, in line. Ireland was actually the whole model of settler colonialism was actually in Ireland, hence why it was particularly much more brutal there compared to Wales and Scotland and whatnot. So I think it's very interesting how in England, for example, where we also have deaths in custody of Black people, lots of human rights abuses the police commit towards immigrants, legal, illegal, legal or otherwise, and whatnot. So when this terrorist attack happened at the Ariana Grande concert, I thought it was very interesting that you had Jeremy Corbyn, one of the most one of the most social justice oriented and a comrade to anti-racism, solidarity and whatnot. But the conversation wasn't about it was a little bit about foreign policy, but it was more like the reason why this occurred, the reason why we're having so much crime in London and elsewhere is because the police have been also the victims of austerity. And if we just reversed all the austerity which we've inflicted on the police, we wouldn't have so much knife crimes, and we would have been able to have gotten the scumbags that blew up in Ariana Grande concert. And so I'm curious, L, your response to that, followed by Berneta, and push back, and then feel free to push back against but then what do we do when extremism does reign its ugly heads?
Well, have the police had any history of being able to stop that? I mean, did they stop 9/11 despite all the intelligence they actually had? And of course, they couldn't even cooperate with each other and dismissed it. We had a mass shooting in Portapique in 2020, the so-called biggest mass shooting in Canada. I mean, I doubt it because, they were mowing down Indigenous people. But in modern history, the biggest mass shooting, the police couldn't stop it. They couldn't even put out a Twitter alert. The guy drove around in a fake police car all night and killed multiple people. So are the police actually effective in stopping serious crime? Don't they spend a lot of their time infiltrating student groups and then, creating terrorists? No, honestly, I'm being ironic, but it's true, right? That
is true. That is true.
Find mentally ill people, be like, we're going to go bomb something, and then go, oh, I caught a terrorist. So half the time they're creating so-called terrorists and jacking people up. They're allowed to lie to you to do that. There's all the whole history, and in the UK, of the police sleeping with women without saying they're cops, infiltrate movements to basically just stitch people up. So the police don't actually have a very strong record of stopping terrorism, despite all the weaponry and money that they get. So if they would solely devote themselves to those kind of activities, there'd be less, perhaps less pushback. But then we know that the category of terrorists, you mean terrorist attacks, the police attack on our communities, right? So, how Muslim people are designated as terrorists is an incredibly politically and problematic category, right? But if the police actually only sat around solving serious crimes, but then that would only be 2% of what they do, because they spend most of their time driving around policing bylaws and coming to people's houses because their neighbors said they were playing music and stuff. In our Defunding the Police report, we do a snapshot of a week in policing, and one reason is that because people have this from watching TV that people think the police are out here constantly dealing with serial killers and murders. They're not. That's the tiniest amount of what they do. What they mostly do is sit around in their cars bored and come to our houses on bylaw offenses and police us because we don't have a decal on our car, and then shoot Philando Castile. That's what's really going on. So I think people have a very distorted picture of what policing actually is, where the resources actually go. They largely go into salaries, at least in Canada. Police are massively on the sunshine list, public workers making more than $100,000 a year is over one more half of that list is police. They make massive amounts in overtime. They make huge amounts of money doing jobs that civilians could do, like policing parades, like policing parking lots, like traffic stuff that we could do on our own. So I think we just have to bust these myths that we get from the media around what we think police do versus what police actually do.
Your response to that, Berneta?
Look, Elle broke it down. I don't even think there's too much more to add. My initial response was going to be, when have they thwarted? I can't think of a single time. So I have nothing further to add. No further comments, Your Honor. None at all.
But then that being said, okay, but then what do we do then when a terrorist attack happens and when an Islamic when a Muslim extremist does a terrorist attack, or when we're the victims of hate crime, when some fascist piece of shit decides to beat the shit out of us, or when the KKK decides to actually put the goddamn hood on and then rain terror, what then do we do? Because I mean isn't that why the police are a necessary evil? Why we do need to have them in some form, as opposed to both of your responses to that.
I would say that in the United States, a good majority of our terrorist attacks are white supremacist. And we've had study after study after study show that the police have been completely infiltrated by white supremacists.
I knew you. I was like, I can see you.
Yeah. I'm like, there's nothing that they can really, there's no benefit to them in these kinds of situations. I would ask any of the folks who experienced Charlottesville, the folks in the church in Charleston, how do they feel about the police taking that one boy to go get a burger before they before they took him to the station and whatnot? How do they feel about the police? Do they really feel like the police were helpful and beneficial? Do they feel that there are other ways that could have been handled? Surely it maybe couldn't have been preventive because they didn't see it coming, but are there other ways the community could have dealt with that young man? I have my thoughts, but I will leave it at that point, because we're not going to talk about felonies on air. But nonetheless,
why not? Why not? Feel free. No, feel free to talk about that.
I think as humans, we have had other ways of dealing with chaos, dealing with those who break the social contract before policing was ever established. Policing is such a new structure. And so it's very interesting to me when folks wonder, well, what would we possibly do about this rapist or about this terrorist if we didn't have police? Maybe there are ways that a community knows how to hold certain folks who break the social contract accountable. That doesn't necessarily require the police. In fact, can we actually say that in those situations like the Charleston massacre, can we actually say that the police and the legal system gave those individuals any justice? Not necessarily. Sure, he has life in prison, but at the end of the day, is that really enough? Did those folks who experienced that actually get the actual, the response, what they needed in that situation to get to some sort of peace after what happened? No, and the police and our legal system as it stands is not capable of providing that, if we're going to be very, very honest. And that's because our legal system has a very Anglo approach to what justice is and to how folks should be handled after committing certain crimes against the social contract. But that's the Anglo system, that's the Anglo system of operating. So yeah, I just get really annoyed to some extent when folks say, well, what about this terrible crime? What do we do then? The police are not thwarting those crimes. And after those crimes are committed, they're usually muddling and making it worse. Any rape victim will tell you, police often make the situation much worse when they go to report it. So my answer is that I don't see any reason we can't figure out a way to handle these kinds of things when they happen without police. I don't see any reason we can figure it out.
But then, Elle, before you respond to that, but doesn't this go back to the issue that that we need to radically reform and restructure the police. So if we really do want the police to solve the murders that take place, or and we will talk about the very thorny issue of sexual assault and stuff like that, because it is important, and we really can, and that's not an issue that we can just push aside. But it isn't the issue that instead of having the police basically throw a black kid in jail just because they have the audacity to get into a fight with another student, and that we actually do say that, like, your budget is only for thwarting crimes, finding out who committed this heinous act, or who roofied a girl and assaulted her. Like, could there be room for a radically reduced police that actually does that and actually can help in somebody overcoming a sexual assault? Both of you respond. L first, and then Berneta.
Yeah, but then why would it need to be constituted as the police? That's the point, right? Like, obviously harm happens. Obviously we want to deal with harm. Obviously, there are some people who cause harm. It's caused by social factors, and most of harm we could deal with by actually addressing poverty, actually addressing racism, returning resources to the community. Then there are some small amount of people who do commit violence. We want to break those cycles. So, like, a lot of child molestation is the result of generational, and I'm not excusing it, but obviously if you interrupt the cycle, you would have more effect than after the fact imprisoning the person, right? So what we mostly want to do is concentrate our resources in identification, prevention, healing, all the things our communities need to actually prevent crime from happening down the road. Like, if somebody rapes me and gets 2 years in prison, I'm already been raped. Like, we want to intervene into violence before that. So what we actually, like, if we have the imagination to think about the police, why don't we have the imagination to think about how we might constitute our communities to actually address sexual violence, to actually address violence within families, to actually give families the kind of resources they need to recover from this kind of generational trauma that leads to violence cycling within families. But okay, yes, some people, a small amount of people are harmful, and what do we do with them? But, like, why do we only have to imagine that the police would be the solution? Why couldn't it be a council of elders within our community? Why can't it be like the many ways? And as I said, like, there's not just European culture. Like, what did our grandmothers do when people abused people, right?
Exactly.
What throughout history? Like, this is a relatively recent, the police are like a 200-year-old institution. People did things before that. So what did we do that worked? What other traditions exist? We live on Turtle Island, where there's Indigenous traditions of justice. What did they do? And of course, part of the reason why crime proliferates, even though it's nowhere near, it's dropped and everything, is because of our modern conditions of living under capitalism. So we want to not dislodge capitalism. We want to keep all the resource scarcity that's only doled out to 1% of the people. We want to keep people living in poverty. We want to deny people all the resources and then go, oh, well, crime happens. And then let's put those people in prison. So we need the police, instead of saying, if we undid all of this, like, wouldn't we not have as much crime? Like, isn't it caused by these issues? So I'm not naive about violence. Those of us who talk about policing, I work with men in prison who have killed people. Like, the Black women who invented transformative justice are all victims of incest, like childhood violence, like real violence in their homes and communities. This isn't people that are like, I think everybody can be hugged. Like, that's not who's actually talking about this. Everybody who's talking about this has experienced the prison system, has dealt with violence and harm. We know that violence is real. We're not naive about it. We know that prison and policing isn't doing anything to dislodge it or help it or heal us or help us as our communities keep safe, and none of those things, while we put billions and billions and billions of dollars into something that does not work. So yes, we can of course say, yeah, like, what about the serial killers? What about this? And that is real. I'm not dismissing it. We have to be able to talk about that, but it does not overwhelm the fact that the vast majority of crimes are crimes of poverty, of mental illness, of social causes, that even violence itself is not pathological in the ways we imagine it. People are shooting each other over guns and drugs and, like, conflict that we can actually intervene in and deal with. So I never want to dismiss violence. I would never tell somebody like, if the option you have to call the police because we don't have anything else. If you got raped or you need to get that man out of your house, you have to do it. If a child is being harmed, we don't have anything else right now, go report. But we understand it's not ideal. And we can spend our energies in building the thing that does work instead of pouring so many resources into something we know does not.
Yeah, because ultimately we're just constantly putting out fires. Why wouldn't we get to the root of the fire before it starts instead of just constantly putting them out? You know, it's exactly what Elle said. It's the question of why. We should be asking ourselves why these particular types of violence why they're occurring. And I would say two things too. And it's not a total non sequitur, but it kind of is. It's like why when we're talking about things like, sexual violence and trauma and things like that, why aren't we talking about the need for universal, in our country, universal healthcare so that everyone has access to mental health and therapy to actually unravel some of these things that contribute to the cycle that Elle is talking about so that cycle is broken? Why aren't we ever connecting the dots between healthcare and the need to actually break these cycles of violence, right? The other thing I'll say is that there's this fabulous documentary out of Chicago called The Interrupters. And you may be familiar with it, Elle. But I love the model that they create and that they show in that documentary about how you have these folks who've gone through a lot of things. A lot of them have been through the system themselves, been imprisoned and so forth. And what they do is that they become sort of leaders and informal counselors in their community, and they interrupt violence before it happens. And so there's this one Black guy in the documentary in particular who's working on the South Side. He's been through the system. He's done a lot. He's seen a lot. And he knows exactly a lot of the root causes of the anger that some of the folks are experiencing that are lashing out. And so there's one guy who's just really, really angry. He's been through a lot of stuff. And this particular interrupter, has to come to him numerous times to stop him from doing something that's going to lead him, land him in jail and whatnot. And the way that he handles it, the care with which he handles it, and the understanding is, to me, representative of why we need community and community members to really sort of communicate with each other and understand each other and be there for each other as support systems. Because so much of what we see happening is because people don't have support systems. They don't have access to mental health care. They're poor and so forth. So there are models beyond Europe. There are models we've seen in the United States, in that Interrupters documentary, for instance, that show police aren't really necessary. If police had come to this guy a couple of times when he was having, a moment where he was just really lashing out, they probably would have shot him, or at the very least, they would have arrested him and he would have ended up in jail for really nothing more than an emotional outburst, for the most part. So,
but then I wonder, and this goes back. Well, and I know exactly where you two are coming from, and I do find, like when the whole Harvey Weinstein and when the whole R. Kelly scandals were coming out, I know for a fact, if I was in any of those panel discussions or even those respectful left-wing discussions, I probably would have gotten in trouble if I had said the following: well, Harvey Weinstein clearly has a mental illness problem. The guy cannot control his earnings and stuff like that. Wouldn't it be better if he was taken to some kind of a mental health facility and taken care of? And R. Kelly, and you both mentioned how a lot of people who actually do commit sexual violence, they themselves are also abused. And then when you have the whole intergenerational trauma that Black people have because we're persecuted for the skin color, and then of course there's the class. We got the worst of both worlds, in that respect. So we got the racism and we got the classism, and Indigenous people too, and Latinx people too, and a lot of sexual violence that that happens. There also happens from somebody who was abused at a very young age and his head was never taken care of, and then those ones also go out and commit sexual crimes. But then, so we're not going to send them to jail then in a post-abolitionist world, but then do we just deal with them in mental health facilities?
Well, I mean,
and of course I was
going to say fuck R. Kelly first of all, but yes, R. Kelly was like, and I mean, abolitionists struggle with this too, because there are some people that you're like, I want that person to be in prison. So I'm not really interested in, having a discussion about R. Kelly that centers him, rather than the Black woman that he spent his time abusing. But yes, it is a fact that R. Kelly himself was sexually abused as a child, and that it could and should have been intervention then. But also, let's not forget the many years that everybody saw what R. Kelly was doing. He was pulling up outside of that junior high school. The choir teacher was letting him go back with the kids. That could not have happened without being enabled by patriarchy and the disregard that the society has for Black women. How is it that Aaliyah, who is a star, this could happen to her? She is a rich Black woman, a young girl. She was a child, but she was a star and she still didn't matter. So R. Kelly is also about the disregard for Black women. And there will be a million R. Kellys, and there are white R. Kellys and Donald Trumps and Kavanaughs and people in the White House and the Supreme Court that have done the exact same thing to Black women. And so the issue wasn't where were the police. The issue was, why can you do this in broad daylight to Black women? And everybody saw it in the studio. Everybody knew he was doing it for years, and nobody said a word. Same with Bill Cosby, same with everybody. So again, that goes back to what is the roots of this violence. And in the case of racialized violence against Black women, until Black women is seen as human, it doesn't matter how much police they are, because they were unrapeable in their eyes anyway. You can call them to the house, and I know 12-year-old girls who got pregnant by like social workers, and it was written in their file that they're prostitutes. There's evidence of the crime. They're 12. They cannot consent. They are clearly a rape victim, and they are being seen as hypersexual, and like they victimize the man. So again, like, how is the police going to fix that? So yeah, I'm not interested in like a conversation where we really go, oh, well, what about like, yeah, like I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, I feel so sorry for R. Kelly. Like R. Kelly is gross and hideous, and like it's disgusting to think about, but it doesn't come where. And when we monster people at the same time, we pretend it's an individual problem and not a systemic problem. So the question with R. Kelly and others is, why could he do this, and why were Black women victims and girls so disregarded? And until we get our hands on that, like everybody.
Berneta, your response.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. And I think that we have to always go back to what are the root causes of these problems? Like, what are the root causes? White supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy. These are some of the root causes. And we could, try to reform police as much as we want, give them all kinds of diversity training. It's not going to get rid of those root foundational issues within the culture. Not to sound like some of these right wingers who are like, well, banning guns aren't going to help, because really it's the culture. Not to sound like them, but it's not that they don't have a point either. You know what I mean? They do have a point. I think they go in the wrong direction entirely, but they have a point. And I'd also say that, yes, there's going to be R. Kelly, there's going to be Donald Trump, there's going to be people with power and money that are able to get away with these things over and over and over again, right in our faces, just really clear in our faces. But I'm not willing to sacrifice an Elijah McClain, another Tamir Rice, just so we can get one R. Kelly, one Donald Trump. I'm just not willing to constantly see people sacrifice at the altar of, well, there's this 1% outlier of terrible people that we need the police for. I just think we have to balance those realities a bit.
Interesting, but and sorry to always recycle this argument that Anime Paul made, but goddamn, it is a very good counter argument, because she did once say, and many right wingers, by the way, they also think this. They say it in a completely different manner, but having talked with some right wingers and studying a lot of their philosophy, a lot of them say that yes, we need to do something about poverty. Yes, we have to help out people who are struggling in poverty, but there are a bunch of people who go to work every day and don't commit and don't beat up somebody for an apple, don't beat up somebody for for a Nike or for an iPhone. Therefore, we have to go after them. And of course, then Anime Paul once said that you can spend millions on social justice programs, and she says she is in favor for them, but there are murderers and rapists. Therefore, we need the police as necessary evil. But we do need to bring justice to people who are victims of police brutality and whatnot.
The calculus that happens here. One R. Kelly means we need the police, but you know how many cops, like in Chicago, they have to pay reparations because they were taking people to a black site prison and raping them.
On the west side.
But we still need the police, right? So the police can rape as many people as they want, violate as many people as they want, kill as many people as they want, and we still need the police. But one R. Kelly will be held up in front of us as like, this is why everything you're saying. So, you know, there's a different calculus going on here, that the one exception or the worst or the monsters held to us is a reason why what we're saying isn't viable. But then the cops are just bad apples when this is so systematic. So I think the problem with this conversation is I'm not interested in using victims as footballs. Like, I think it's a real question. Like, how do we deal with harm? It's a question we do not have a good answer to because we have not practiced. We don't know how to deal with our friends who are rapists. We don't know how to deal with our family members who are rapists. And there is ways we could. It is not impossible, but we have not been given the tools to do that. We've not been told that we, as like women, can get together and talk about sexual violence, and we can, when there's domestic violence, intervene. We haven't been given the resources to make safe shelters. We haven't been taught how to deal with conflict. We're not taught, especially Black people, are not taught how to deal with our emotions. And what do I do when I become upset and I'm enraged and I feel like I want to kill somebody? Who is there for me because of my trauma? When I go from 0 to 100, right? These aren't, like, we haven't invested any time in any of that. And then we're like, if we don't have the answer right now for what to do with the rapist, everything you're saying is bullshit. And I think that, like, we have to take harm seriously. It has happened to us. Like, we are also victims of harm. Those of us who are speaking about this are not people speaking from outside of harm. Like, we have experienced harm as well. There are people I have laid awake and wanted to kill. You know, like, I have thought about, like, that, like, in detail. You know, but then I also think about, but they have family. What would it mean to do that harm? Like, what is the actual thing? Like, these are very real feelings. The cop in our heart and the cop in our head, right? Wanting vengeance is a very real human feeling. I'm not here to tell victims how to feel about, like, their rapist or their abuser. Like, that's not, you know, that, like, but we also can't just use those questions as gotchas, right? That the only time right-wingers or whoever wants to talk about rape victims is when they want to throw it in our face when we talk about police abolition. But if you care so much about rape victims, why aren't you out like helping rape victims? Aren't you forcing 11-year-old girls who've been raped to give birth right now? So why are you talking to me about suddenly you care about rape victims, right? So I just think that it's in a way an indelicate and unkind way to have a conversation for victims, that we only talk about victims when we want to prove why we need the police. But we're not interested in victims in any other context. Like, otherwise we're telling victims to get over it. Shut up. Why are you being like that? It's been a long time. Like, he said he was sorry, right? Like, all of that stuff is still happening. So again, like, I mean, it is very serious. I never want to be part of a conversation that minimizes harm, that tells people that they have to forgive those who have harmed them just out like that with nothing else. I don't think that's anybody's place. That is a very deeply personal conversation. But I point out that, you know, the only time that people really want to bring up, like, we have prison now, like, rape victims still exist. Like, it hasn't gone down. Like, since when do rapists get put in prison? Like, 1% of rapes end up in someone being incarcerated. So we're happy for 99% of rapists to get away now, like, because what we're doing isn't working. So then we want to talk about rape victims. Like, so yeah.
A counter to that, but Berneta, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, Elle was just breaking it down. There's really not too much I can add to that. I mean, I will just emphasize what I said before. I think anytime we center, this 1% of folks like R. Kelly or whatever, anytime we center them, we are decentering their victims, number one. And we're also saying, well, it's okay that all these other folks die in police shootings and so forth, as long as the police are there to get this one guy, right? I just think we have to always center, you know, the idea of justice should be what we strive for. And the idea of justice needs a lot of tweaking, a lot of conversation around it. We don't actually, I don't think, have a really good sense as a culture of, like, what justice really looks like. Like Elle said, people should be allowed to feel their vengeance, for instance. They should be allowed to feel that. Justice shouldn't just be, oh, well, at least they got put in jail for 20 years. Now you have to forgive and move on. Right? Justice is a lot of different things for different people. And, you know, the last thing I'll say is that centering people like R. Kelly, you know, this percentage of folks who are just, they seem incorrigible. They just seem like the worst kind of folks.
Yes, and forgive me if I am guilty of that.
Yeah. What it does, though, is it sets up for failure any alternative we ever come up with. Because as soon as we have another R. Kelly or another Harvey Weinstein or, I don't know, Ted Bundy or whatnot, it's going to be like, well, look, that's why we needed police. We knew the system wasn't going to work. It sets any alternative we come up with for failure. Because at the end of no, go right ahead.
But then, what would a system where there's no, okay? But then, what would a system if there's no police? Because the way we deal with crime is not the lock them up in jail where they're going to get raped or beaten up by somebody else or abused by police officers and whatnots. And even if some are sent to a mental institution, there are systemic human rights abuses that also exist in mental institutions of people being, victimized by the orderlies, the nurses, and whatnot like that. So then, how would a world where somebody does commit sexual violence on the girl they fancied, or even the boy they fancied, or their own siblings and stuff like that? How how would that actually? Berneta, you have to rush off soon, don't you? Right? Or
Yeah.
okay. Okay. Then just respond. How would justice look then in a world where some of those crimes will still be committed, but the response isn't the the very punitive, disgusting responses of the U.S. and Britain and so forth, where you just throw them in jail and they get abused in jail or in mental institutions if they are found guilty of having a mental.
Yeah. Ooh, you froze a little bit. I mean, I would say we have to look back at indigenous cultures and the ways that our forefathers and foremothers handle these kinds of matters. It's not as if these kinds of things never happened before. I think we need to look outside of the European tradition and the Anglo-American legal system that ours is based on, to figure out ways that work for people in the past and adapt them for the present. This limited perspective that we have is really, it stems from white supremacy. It stems from this idea that it's like there is nothing that existed before these European systems were put in place. So I think it's very important to look back.
Berneta, can you? Sorry to ask you to do this, but can you actually repeat that because my internet got disconnected?
Yeah, you were definitely glitching, so I was wondering if you heard any of it. No, I would say we have to look back to figure out how to go forward. We have to look at those systems that were in place in our indigenous cultures and cultures outside of Europe to see what worked for them. These types of behaviors and violence aren't new. They've always happened in some form or fashion. And how did people handle them before our colonial era? How did people handle them before these European traditions became our standard? It's really a symptom of white supremacy that we can't think beyond the systems that we currently have, is my perspective on it.
Yeah, let's not forget that the prison was a social justice innovation, right? People were being executed and transported, left in the assizes, and the prison was actually reformers, right? That people can be actually changed. You don't have to just kill someone because they stole something. And of course, the way they thought it up was incredibly elitist and class and violent. Like they thought solitary confinement, this is the Auburn system, right? If you like read your Bible and do hard labor, your soul and your body will be reformed. It was obviously a brutal system. But the point is, and I don't want to because white supremacy always masks itself in benevolence and good intentions. But the point is that it was a change. And I imagine at the time, we're like, what do you mean you want to put people in a prison? Like, you're not hanging them? You hug a thug, So how is it that we can't 200 years later come up with something else? That we're just stuck with this thing that the Victorians created. There didn't used to be prisons, right? They're not an infinite thing, God planted on this earth. So yes, our inability to think beyond and say, well, what else could we do? What else has happened? How did other people address this? And of course, part of it's based on the idea that since our cultures must have been inherently primitive, we were always just hunting people down and eating them or something, so we couldn't have anything to contribute, right? But we had souls of women, we had ways of dealing with abusers, we had Sometimes there was all kinds of like exile, different practices, and like how do you adapt that? And this is what transformative justice is about. And I think also the point is like, how often has white supremacy failed? White supremacy is a failed system. It gets to try over and over again. But if we don't have the answer right now for how to undo everything with white supremacy, it seems invalid. So no, we don't know everything. How could we? We don't have billions of dollars every year to try out these systems. So there's this imbalance that happens where white supremacy, policing, all these things get to fail over and over and over again, and they just need another chance. Now we can fix it. And then when we say, well, maybe we could try something else, as I said, then one person who's been through a transformative justice process rapes somebody again, and oh, like, see, you guys are just stupid. That's gone. And it's like, but we haven't had the chance to try it out and work on it and fix it. So we don't get anything of the same grace that this brutal system of capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy has got, that we still try to preserve and put all our energy into. What would that look like if 1/1,000,000th of our energy went into like giving some supports to communities to actually try different things and say this worked, this didn't? Like,
Elle, before
at the end of the day, Youri, what is our history as a species but trial and error anyway? And so we have to like try things to know what's going to work. We can't just sort of dig our heels in and say, well, you know, it's just unchangeable. That's just not the way we've ever like worked as a species anyway. We have to try new things and fail and then try again and maybe succeed the next time. So not to sound all new agey, but that's just kind of how we are.
But you think that starts the whole having a compassionate world, the whole you think it starts first though with police abolitionism, right?
No, I think it starts with mutual aid in our community. I think it starts with practicing within our community what we want to see. So abolition, we're not going to see the police end in our lifetimes, but we can sit down with our elders and talk about sexual violence. We can cook meals with our community and get together and use our community gardens and learn how to live together. We can teach our children how to identify their emotions and solve conflict. We can organize in our buildings against our landlords. We can do mutual aid and bring each other groceries and care for our elders. And those are practices that teach us to live with each other. And as we do those things, we come into conflict. We have to learn how to work through it. We deal with violence with each other. We deal with people who are harming us. And we, within those groups, start to learn those practices. It's on the land, it's in our community. So abolition isn't just a theoretical, like, let's just, you know, if aliens came down tomorrow and beamed up every cop, there'd be private security forces within 12 hours, like in every white community, right? Because we haven't gotten rid of the ideology behind it, our will to punishment. Like, we haven't done any of that work. So we have to, abolition begins with starting to do that work, like challenging ourselves, our families, and then more broadly. So it happens every day. And that's where I believe it starts. I'm practical in that sense. Like, if we don't work on it, how will we know?
I have a final question for you, Elle. But Berneta, I know that you have to get going. So if you want, so if you have to sign off, feel free to sign off now. But thank you so much for coming on along with me and Elle, and hope to do more of these with you in the very near future.
Well, thank you for having me, and it was really great to meet you, Elle. Hopefully, we'll stay in touch. Wonderful to meet you. All right, bye, Elle. Bye. Nice to meet you.
And then, so Miss Jones, final question for you before before I start.
I'm dying too because I'm in my office. I don't have a light, so it's good. This is a question disappearing. Go ahead.
Actually, right now, like the lights I usually have right here. My bathroom light is broken, so I have to use that light over there. So that's why, like, it's very dark. But if I put this extra light there, like it,
in my office, it's dark outside now, so I was getting light through the window, and now I lost my front lighting. But sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, before I stop recording, and there was a question I actually wanted to ask you off the air. I didn't get the chance to ask you off the air because so I'm not going to bring it up during this recorded conversation then. But then, so then one, So one final question before we end this is that idea of restorative justice or transformative justice, which I would love to talk to more people who are part of your movement, who have actually experienced firsthand all of the grotesque violence from the state, violence from within their own community and stuff like that. Because I actually, maybe they'll be able to, convert me into, into abolitionism and extends, my compassion and stuff like that. Because at the same time, like I'm against the death penalty, but at the same time, and of course there are folks who, even though, who even though they've had family and loved ones murdered by the person who was executed, but they're against, the death penalty because they say it doesn't bring the person back, and we've just lowered to that person's level, especially if they don't show any remorse at all for the grotesque crimes they've done. But at the same time, like when it comes to somebody who has committed, like, a sexual assault, who shows no remorse, whatsoever, and even gets off scot-free and stuff like that, how would a system without prison where every now and then you have the one person who actually does go into jail for their serial raping and stuff like that, how would that work in a world without prisons and police?
I don't think anyone's arguing those people shouldn't be somewhere where they can't harm others. The question is, does that have to look like a prison, right? So people used to exile people from community. Obviously, in the day, like now, that wouldn't work because, like, if you kick someone out of Halifax, you just go to Toronto, right? Like, but before, like, you were sending people into the wilderness and stuff. Like, there's always been a practice of, like, you can't be around us. And so no one's saying that if somebody's, like, serial killing a bunch of women, we just need to just let them do it because we're not for punishment. But the question is, does that have to look like the punitive space of a prison? Like, why do we, for example, feel great joy at thinking that R. Kelly might be raped, right? Like, why is that part of our discourse? Oh, well, now don't drop the soap in there, right? Like, why do we fantasize in these ways about people facing violence? Why does that give us a kind of joy and vindication? What does that say about us? Now, that's no longer about saying that we need to be kept safe from this person, or not even about the victims. It's about something else, right? So if R. Kelly cannot be without harming women, if he's pathologic, he can't be stopped, he needs to be away from people. But why does that have to look like a security max prison, or can it look like, I don't know, like a place where he's kept away and watched, but can also go outside? Like, so what is it about, you know what I mean? Like, we also have to think about what it is that we want out of this, because we say safety, public safety, but then we want also vengeance. We say punishment, but then we want something above the punishment, and punishment is never enough, right? The part of the problem of punishment is today's harsh punishment is like tomorrow's normal punishment is the future's like not enough punishment. So punishment always expands.
And I think you told me the first time we talked about this that that's how we get this avalanche of
life sentences, ever expanding. So people are in prison, and then it's like not good enough, and people want to imagine that they don't have TV and books, and that's not good enough. So now we have to imagine that they're raped, and that's not good enough. So like, let's chain them to the wall, and that's not good enough. So let's just feed them bread and water, and that's not good. It's never good enough because you're not addressing the actual underlying feeling, the will to punishment. So I don't think anybody's arguing that, a Paul Bernardo or Robert Picton or whoever should just be skipping around in a field with puppies. Like, like, well, I mean, actually, I don't know why they couldn't have puppies if that was part of healing them. But, like, I'm just saying that there's a difference between removing people from us to keep safe and imagine that as a vengeful place. And prison as it's constituted is an extremely vengeful place, A, and B, it never contains itself. So even if we make a mutualist, if you and I sat down and we just agreed, okay, this person, all these people are people that we can both agree that we want in prison. I've agreed and you'd agree. Like, we both think that these people, that will it never just contains to that, right? In the same way as you're like, why can't we just fund the police to like catch terrorists? Because it never contains to that. Once we have the police, they are always going to come to your home because your neighbor reported you. They are always going to be coming to arrest the homeless person because they exist and they will be instrumentalized and they will always expand. So, and this has happened with the police, right? Like through the war on drugs, through like arming the police and giving them weapons. Like every history we have shows that punishment regimes expand and expand and expand, and it is never, ever enough. So the problem is that it is not possible to designate the group of people that we have all mutually decided are outside of the human, and these things will only be given to them because we will one day, we become that them. All Black people are inherently that them. Humanity is defined against us. We are always that them. So this is the problem, right? That we want to imagine that the bad people and the good people can be separated, whether through who committed violence and who didn't, or who's this and who's that, but it will always, always shift. And one day it will come to us, you know, or to those we love, or to those we don't think are over the line. And we know this, that prisons are not built in response to crime. They are built and then we fill them. When we build prisons, we find a crime to fit it. If we built a prison for, I don't know, like if we decided that, you know, this is going to be a crime and these 5 people that committed are going to go to that prison, it would not say 5 people. In Canada, when we had one prison for women, K4W, Kingston Prison for Women, there was never more than 40 federally incarcerated women. We built 5 regional prisons and the Healing Lodge, and now there's over 500 federally incarcerated women, nearly half of whom are Indigenous. We found the woman to fill it. How did we go to, is there suddenly a crime wave where women just lost their minds and started like, no, you know, at the same time as we did that, we had austerity politics. We stripped social welfare and we criminalized things like bouncing a check or committing welfare fraud, like not reporting an income or whatever, right? Like we will always find crimes to fill this. So our concern isn't that nobody is not acknowledging that there are not people that are brutal and vicious and that, you know, we need an answer to. But we can imagine or think about how to remove those people and keep them away, you know, like not allow them access to victims. We could also perhaps imagine resources where we might, you know, do some attempt at like healing them or like work on them or whatever. But
in other words, adjust mental health care, which is merged with a single payer healthcare system.
Yeah, and then people are like, oh, you know, like, why should that pedophile like get health care when I don't have a doctor on the outside, right? So we always have this like austerity thing, right? Like if we give a person in prison, like if we said, okay, like we're gonna put this person away, they have, you know, access to things, like they can read a book, they can go, you know, they can ask for books from the library, like we're not going to control that. They can watch TV, they have a decent space where their bed is, like their head doesn't need to be right next to the toilet. Of course people would be like, you know, I don't even have a house, you know, because this is also part of capitalism where what we imagine, one, it's always this idea that it takes away from, right? So I'm just saying that underlying prison is the prison and the police aren't even in the end the issue. It's our will to punishment. It's our idea of who is excluded from humanity. It's our need to have people within capitalism who are discarded and who are not part of the public. And that will ever grow and expand. So yes, you know, there are real people who cause harm. And again, I always feel like in this conversation, it's like I don't want to disavow that. Like I don't ever want to be on record sounding like I don't think violence is serious or that it doesn't have generational impact so that people aren't really harmed. Like in some ways it feels gross because you're like, there's someone out here who's like family member is being murdered right now. And I don't want to be just like sitting here having this theoretical conversation about them. Like it is real. And we need to hold that in front of us. And those of us who want to address harm cannot deny that. Like we can't pretend it doesn't happen because we want to make an argument, because this isn't about making an argument or winning a debate. This is actually about human life and like how we're going to proceed on this planet together. And like, what can we do to stop harm and how do we address it? And these are very serious things. And like, we don't really get the venue to do it because it becomes this like series of gotchas, right? Like, oh, Elle, you love rapists. Well, if you said that you think prison is bad, oh, like now you think people should be right. Aha, I got you, you know, and it's like, but that's not the conversation we're trying to have. It is a complex conversation. It's a difficult conversation. It's a traumatic conversation. It requires us often to think deeply about the violence we have experienced and the violence we have perpetuated, the harm that we have done to others and how we have not been accountable to it and how others have not been accountable to us and the way that we've had no way to get through that. As I said, people have harmed me and I have been enraged. I have willed things upon them. You know, I have dreamed that demons would haunt them, you know, but like, I also know that that does not bring peace or healing. That does not solve the problem. And I know we need something better than our own will to punishment, which lives in me too, because I am not a better person than anybody else, you know, and I'm not interested in being a better person than anybody else. And I'm not interested in telling people to get over their harm. And I'm not interested in pretending it doesn't happen, but I am interested in saying, you know, like, given that these things are there, like what can we do today for the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? Because surely we shouldn't be 200 years from now and still sitting there going, well, I don't know, there's rapists, so I guess we just have to have prisons, right? Like there has to be a way to intervene in it. Like
but there also needs to be a better way than just the I'm an atheist, but there also has to be a better way than just this kind of like thunder and the kind of jeez, I can't think.
Yeah, well, I mean, like
kind of like the kind of like like thunder and bolts Bible, where it's like this person needs to be like like burned to like like the ground, and they're nothing but like dust. I tried to come at it from a much more compassionate thing.
And to be raped in prison, are you willing to go do it?
Hell
right?
No.
So the people, right? People that are like, oh, that person should be beaten to death. Okay, go do it. Like, go get your hands dirty. You don't want, so what you want is for it to happen, but for it to be on somebody else, right? And this is why,
the kind of like NIMBY, not my backyards.
Yeah. So people will be like, ha ha ha, they'll drop this up. It's like, okay, so if you think that child rapists should be raped, then are you volunteering to go and rape people? Because if you're not willing to do that, then you need to think about why you're not willing to do it, but why you think it's a punishment that should happen, right? Like, so, there's a reason why, cases of the state versus rather than us personally, because it left up to us personally, yeah, someone killed my family, I'd be like hunting them down, right? That's why I'm not in charge, right? That's why you don't get to, that's why we don't have vigilante justice. These are very normal human things to feel, but we have outsourced the state for a reason, because we recognize that if you leave it up to people, like, then we'd all, there's a cycle of things, it would never stop. It's Romeo and Juliet, like Montagues and Capulets. But the state also isn't addressing it. So I think in a very careful way, in a nuanced way, in a compassionate way, in a way that isn't afraid of difficulty, in a way that does not shy away from harm, we need to have these conversations. And we're not going to be good at them. We're not going to have the answers right now. I'm not going to sit here and say I know what to do if somebody, I know what to do when the serial rapist arises. I don't know what to do. Because we have struggled in our communities to get rid of people who touch women and people who prey upon young women. We have tried and failed, to like even get that person to like not come to an event,
And then you also have the case of the people who actually are very remorseful, but they're just scared to death of actually admitting, yes, I did this and I'm completely sorry about it. But the punishment is just, okay, well, you're going to be in jail and you're going to get raped there and you're going to get brutalized there. And then when you do get out there, everyone's going to continue to not forgive you. And then that's where awful things like the Clinton crime bill, where you're not allowed to vote anymore, not allowed to live with your own family, even if they've forgiven you, not allowed to have any access to welfare and stuff like that. And if you can't find a job within 3 months, you're going to be back in prison.
Yeah, so we say prison is a punishment, and then we extend the punishment for life beyond prison. So if prison is the punishment, if the sentence is the punishment, why, when you're done that, is it not done? But you still can't live in housing, you still can't get a job, you still this, that, and the other thing, proving the falsity of the idea of the prison, right? Like, if you thought prison was the thing, then you'd assume that the person, when they were done their sentence, was like rehabilitated or whatever and ready to go, but we don't think that. So, and like, we don't give victims any closure. Like, once the case is over, like, you're on your own, right? Like, nobody is like actually helping you to heal. So there are systems, people have gone through restorative justice, and some people, it's worked for them, but I can't impose that on other people. And again, that I think is a very gendered narrative. Women in particular are always like told to forgive, like it's part of like being nice. So I don't think you can impose that on other people. Like, you need to forgive, like forgiveness is for you. It's personal, like you have to come to a place in your own journey and healing and thoughts where you don't want to have that rage in you, and like you have to go through your own process, and that cannot be imposed on you by anybody else but yourself, and like nobody has the right to tell you what pace, or like nobody has the right to tell anybody that. Like, I would never say to somebody, oh, you need to just like forgive, like that. Who can tell somebody that? That's between you, yourself. If you have a God, your God, like those kind of things. Like, but that doesn't mean as a society we can't, again, like, oh, look, that's where my house key is. That doesn't as a society, my drawer is open. I was looking for this. I never I always buzz into my building. I never open the door. And then with the storm, the power's off. I'm like, I can't leave my house because I can't get back in. I was like, where are my keys? Sorry, guys.
Well,
anyway, we are done. So I think that's enough. I just think that, yeah, it is a complex conversation, and it's one that's going to take us many, many, many decades and generations to work out. And we have to acknowledge that and not shy away from it being complex. But in fact, policing and prisons offer us a really seemingly easy solution that we don't have to think about. The person called the police, it's out of my hands, and then somebody else took care of it. And it actually means that we as communities don't have to do the work. So we don't actually have to learn to deal with any of this because somebody else we're outsourcing it. Somebody else is going to get rid of that homeless person. Like, I don't want to see it. Out of sight, out of mind, right? And the richer you are, the more ability you have to put up the fence, to call it, to gate the community, to call the police, to have the security guard, so you don't have to deal with it. And we are going to have to deal with it if we want to have a solution. So all of us are going to have to get our hands dirty.
There's a question I want to ask. There's a question I want to ask you off the air, but I think that's a good place to end it. We were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Berneta L. Haynes, who is an sci-fi fantasy author, consumer protection attorney, and she also helps out other writers and outspoken leftists. And we were also joined by the brilliant, stupendous, fantastic Al Jones, social justice warrior, who teaches political and cultural studies at Mount Saint University in Canada, contributor to The Breach, and is a poet, and folks should get her book of poetry, and she also has a new book out, but we're going to talk about that another time. Miss Jones, I'm going to press stop recording right now.
Thank you for having me.